Hey you guys, it's Peter, and welcome to my channel, Peterisms, where I tell stories of my life and just little things that I have learned as I've grown into the person that I am today. And I was just going to do my weight loss journey update on my Peter Does Stuff channel, and then I was going to film a vlog today, but Alex is downstairs catching up on Love Island and Watch What Happens Live and a bunch of other shows. So I thought that I would film a couple other videos, and I want to talk about this before I forget like how impactful it was for me. So last night, I watched a few episodes of Sister Wives, and then I wanted to watch some kind of documentary, and my friend Tanya had recommended this documentary to me, and what I thought that she had recommended to me and what she actually recommended to me were two different things. And so by the time that I was getting started on it, I was like, this is going to be too long to watch. So I was kind of like looking through things that I wanted to watch. And I had forgotten about the new documentary that came out by Andrew McCarthy, the actor, called Bratz on Hulu. And so Bratz is a documentary that follows up with the Brat Pack 30-some years later, right? Being like Emilio Estevez, Andrew McCarthy, Rob Lowe, Demi Moore, Ali Sheedy, Molly Ringwald, Judd Nelson. They were in St. Elmo's Fire, and they were in, Pretty in Pink, and all of those like young movies back in the day. And it kind of does a follow-up all these years later. And so Andrew McCarthy goes and he meets with several of the people that were in this supposed Brat Pack. And at one point, he meets with Demi Moore. Now, here's the thing, is that the whole behind the scenes of the documentary is that this guy wrote this article, and this article came out like right at the same time that the movie St. Elmo's Fire came out, which is like one of my favorite movies of life, incidentally. And the movie, or the article, named all of them as part of the Brat Pack, as kind of a play off of the Rat Pack, or like the singers and things like that. And so it was kind of a play off of that. He interviews the writer of the article later in the documentary, and he explains why he came up with that name and how he came up with that name, and really doesn't really back away from like how he feels about it. But anyway, the documentary is really about how it affected all these actors basically being labeled brats, which is interesting because in retrospect, I never really thought of that. Like, I mean, I thought it was kind of like just a funny haha kind of name, and everybody kind of wanted to be part of that. It was like the supermodel period of time. Like, I was like, oh my God, it seems like so much fun. Like all these, Naomi Campbell, Linda Evangelista and stuff. But anyway, there was a part in there, because really what it's about is how greatly he was affected emotionally on his perspective of life and his role in the world and things like that. And so he's going and he's interviewing each of these actors about all this. I'll probably do my Peter Watches TV video about this today too. But anyway, this part really stuck out to me. There's a part in the movie where he's interviewing Demi Moore, and he's talking about like, did it change everything for you? And she was like, no, not really. It didn't. Whereas the rest of them, it greatly affected them. And he's like, okay, can you kind of explain it to me? And she says this quote in here, and I loved this quote because it reminded me of something that my sponsor says to me. And she said, everything is happening for us and not to us. And you can't be selective about that. And I thought about that, like I paused it and I like rewound it and I listened to it again, and like I paused it and I rewound it and I listened to it again, and I was like, that is such a profound statement, right? She says, everything is happening for us, not to us. And you can't be selective about that, right? And then she goes on to say that what happens to us in life is, and I'm not much of a believer in that, like, everything that happens to us, it happens for a reason. I'm not much a believer in that. But I am a believer that those things that happen to us in our lives, we can find meaning out of. We can, make meaning out of. And she goes on to say that those things that happen to us in our lives, like if we look at, oh, this is happening to me, right? Then we basically, she doesn't go so deep into this to say it, but the second part I'll explain to you. But she basically is saying that if we feel like things are happening to us in our lives, then what we feel like is we go into this victim state, right? Like, oh, poor me, everything's happening to me, this is always happening to me, whatever. If we look at the world instead of these things that have happened in our lives, right, as things that are happening to us, but instead of things that are happening for us, if we change our mindset about that. When I was getting my master's degree, we talked a lot about paradigm shifting and looking at like things in different ways and different perspectives, right? And if you look at it, instead of things that happen to us or have happened to us in our lives happened to us, but instead maybe looking at it as it happened for us, right? Which is a really hard thing to get around some of the horrific crap that happens in our lives. But if for a moment you can get behind that and say, okay, maybe this didn't happen to me, maybe it happened for me, then what it does is it changes you out of the victim mentality into the mentality of, okay, so if this happened for me, then what's something that I can learn from this? What's the takeaway? And she goes into explain that then it offers opportunities on how we look at the world. It offers us opportunities on what's the takeaway from this, right? Instead of constantly going through life, which he does, because this is why he's making this documentary. He has gone through his entire life looking at this article that named them all the Brat Pack. He's gone through his entire life, and even when even after this interview with Demi Moore, he goes into this interview with the writer, and he's so defensive and so angry. Like, he's gone through his whole life feeling like this is something that has happened to him. And what she's saying is, if in that moment you can instead look at it as something that has happened for you, okay, then what you can say is, well, what's the opportunity that I can take away from this? How did it change my life in a greater way? Did I meet people that I wouldn't have met had I not gone through this? Did I experience things that I wouldn't have experienced had I not gone through this? Do I look at the world in a different way than I would have had I not gone through this? What are the opportunities that it has afforded me by going through this horrific crap in my life, right? It's a completely different way. One of the things that I think in the last couple years, especially that I've looked at, is when really bad stuff happens to us in our lives, or things that are unsettling or we're not happy with, right? That, I think in that moment, obviously, or for months or years after, you have every right to be upset, angry, lost, fearful, sad about those situations, right? But if we always just stay stuck in that anger and that loss and that feelings of fear and sadness, then what is ever gained from this horrific situation happening in our lives? And I think that a lot of people would offer and say, well, there is nothing to be gained from it. That's not how I want to look at my life. I don't want to stay stuck in anger and fear and sadness and pain and resentment. I just don't, right? Even with the most horrific stuff, I don't. I want to look at it. I want things that happen to me in my life shape me into a different person, into a better person, into looking at the world in a more loving, forgiving, with a more loving, forgiving eye, with looking at the world as maybe these are opportunities that are being gifted to me instead of things that are being taken away from me, and how I look at the world, right? And when I was reading this, because the thing where she says, the part in here where she says, everything is happening for us and not to us, and you can't be selective about that. And so what she's saying, and you can't be selective about that, is you can't pick and choose, right? Like saying, well, okay, like this horrible thing that happened to me, or this good thing that happened to me, that happened for me, right? Because she's talking about the good, the bad, the indifferent, right? That all of it. If it's good, if it's bad, whatever happens to us in our life, if it's excellent, if it's a tragedy, that's happening for us. Because if you're looking at the good stuff and you're saying, that happened for me, like I deserved that. Well, I mean, that's tricky then when the bad stuff happens, because I think that's what plays with our heads. We're like, did we deserve this? And so what she's saying is that nothing is selective. If we look at it from that point of view, that everything, maybe not like, this is a way to look at the world, not that it actually, this is the way that it is, just a way to look at the world, right? That you can't be selective in that. And so when the good things happen, when the bad things happen, you look at them and you say, okay, if I look at it from the point of view that this is happening for me, what's the takeaway, right? Because I can't be selective about that. It's very much like, when we want to play God and say, well, God's in this, but God's not in that. And it reminded me of this quote that my sponsor has said to me 1,000 times that has been so powerful to me. And what she says is, you cannot pick your agnosticism. And I love that statement, right? Because as a person that does have a higher power, what she would say to me is, she'd say to me things like, Peter, like, you really believe that God is in this or that God is in that, but you don't believe that God is in that or God is in that, And I struggled with that for a long time. And it kind of got me to where I am today, because I would be like, oh, if something really great happened to me, I'd be like, oh, thank you, God, God is in that. But when some really horrible shit happened in my life, I'd be like, God's not part of that at all. And she'd say, you can't pick your agnosticism. You can't pick when God is or isn't in certain things. If you believe God is, God is. God is in everything. Well, it really changed my perspective on how I look at God being, I don't believe that God is necessarily in the wonderful shit, and I don't believe that God necessarily is in the horrible shit at all. I don't believe that it works that way. I don't believe there's meaning to be found behind things, right? You know, it's like if somebody's over here saying, oh, like God did this for me and this is an amazing thing, then is God also in that child that's 3 months old fighting for his life at the children's hospital tonight? I can't reconcile that. What I do believe is that God can be in how we deal with those things. You know, I shared this not too long ago that a friend of mine, for years, I'd heard the statement in sobriety, you know, that God never gives us more than we can handle in a day. And my friend said, I don't agree with that statement. He said, I believe that God gives us a lot we can't handle within a day. But with God, we can get through anything. And I was like, that's such a powerful statement, right? Because then what that does is that takes away God being in everything, right? And what it does is it means that God is with us all along and how we get through these things. But God's not in those things. God's maybe not anymore in the 3-month-old dying at the children's hospital than God is in the amazing, wonderful things that happens to us, right? And we can't be selective about that. It's those things are happening randomly, or we're working for them, or it's just how the world goes. And it's how we look at it. So maybe the world is so much more about perspective, you know? Maybe there is no sense to be made out of all of this stuff. I think we live in a world, or I live in a world where, I should just speak for myself, for so much of it, I have tried to live in this place of trying to make sense out of the senseless, you know? Why did this happen? You know? Why did this happen? You know, in all honesty, like with the accident, one of the things that was the hardest thing was, why did this happen to him and not to me? That was something that I lived with every single day and still live with to this day. Every day I think that, you know? Why did this man pass away and I didn't, right? Like, I don't know that I believe that God is in that. I think God is in how we move through that. I think there's no sense to be made out of that, right? I don't believe there's like some grand plan about all that kind of stuff. I don't know. I mean, my opinion's changed about that over time. But God is in how we move through the world and how we do things, right? It's the language that we speak. It's our perspective on how we look at the world. But it doesn't mean that, you know, if this happens or that happens, that God's necessarily in all of it, right? Maybe these things are all, if we look at them from the perspective of, you know, what happens to us in our life, it's how we look at it. Because we can't change those things. They've happened. You know, I wish I could. I wish I could change, you know, 100 of the horrible things that have happened in my life that I've been part of, right? I can't change those. So then if I can't change them, do I want them just to exist as horrible things? Or do I want to learn from them and be a better person and make, you know, choices based on what I've learned from that, you know? And so then it does offer me opportunities on how I look at things in the world, right? And I can't be selective about that. I have to look at everything that way. You know, I have to look at my successes and my losses that way. I think it's a good way to question. I think, and I don't want to, you know, take this away from anybody, but in my youth, when I believed that things happened for reasons, if there was meaning behind everything, it was like this mystical way of looking at the world. And as I've gotten older and I've been through some horrific shit in my life, you know, what I've realized is that a lot of stuff that happens is just randomly senseless and makes no sense whatsoever. You know, you can't figure it out. It just did. It just happened. And a lot of the wonderful things that happened to us happened because of luck or timing, right? It wasn't because some of us worked really, really hard. I've seen some people work really, really hard that don't have half the success or even a fourth of the success that other people had that just lucked into it, right? And playing God is saying, oh, well, God's in that, but God's not in that. Or maybe it's how we look at it. Maybe it's all in our perspective on how we look at it. And I love that Demi Moore said that. You know, if you change your perspective, not that means that that's the truth, okay? That these things that are happening to us are happening for us, not to us, right? I'm not saying that that's how you look at the world, but if that's how you perceive things after the fact, to look at it that way, that completely changes things, right? And that's pretty powerful. So anyway, let me know what you think in the comment section below. I just wanted to share that quote with you guys. I love you, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.